I think it accident is up.
All right, yeah. So getting into the kind of meat of this training here, we're gonna start by talking about rent reasonableness. So what is rent reasonableness? So basically, it's used to ensure that units supported by CoC or other grant funds are not more expensive than similar units that are being supported without grant funds. So we have the federal regulation cited there, but it says CoC funds may only be used on a unit if the rent is reasonable as determined by the recipient or subrecipient, taking into account the unit's location, size, quality, amenities, facilities, management, and maintenance. So generally, rent reasonableness is most important when discussing like units that clients will be utilizing. Technically, rent reasonableness also applies to any kind of structures or units being paid for CoC funds. But for the most part, this is really just a concern when you're trying to get clients housed into like apartments. So when should rent reasonableness be determined and documented? So this is very important that rent reasonableness needs to be determined and documented before a lease has been signed and before any CoC funds are expended. So you have to sign it before the initial lease at that lease up time. And you're also required to do another rent reasonableness check when you're doing a renewal of a lease. So once someone has been in housing for a year and their lease is coming up for renewal, you would need to check that even if they are staying in the same unit, you would need to check that that unit would still be classified as reasonable with regards to the rent. Recipients must also have consistent written policies that define the project's policies and procedures for determining and documenting rent reasonableness. This is usually something that HUD will check for if you're ever being monitored. So there's one reason to have it. The other reason to have it is just because it's helpful and required. So yeah, the program policies and procedures with regards to rent reasonableness should clearly identify the staff person who is responsible for performing the rent reasonableness check. So it's possible maybe there's one person at the agency who is staffed with performing all the rent reasonableness checks, or maybe a specific case managers are responsible for that for their clients. Either of those kind of arrangements would be fine, but it is important that those roles are clearly identified and assigned in your policies and procedures, so there's no kind of confusion on who is supposed to be doing that. And then your policy should also clearly define what exactly is considered reasonable. So we will go into shortly how you check for rent reasonableness, which generally involves comparing it to other similar units in the area. But you will also need to specify, like if you're taking an average price of similar units, you would need to specify kind of what the cap is. Like, are you considering reasonable nothing above that average price? Or maybe you can go $50 above that average price and still be considered reasonable. That is kind of up to programs to decide for themselves. But again, needs to be clearly outlined in policies and procedures so it can be implemented the same throughout. So this slide will go into how to determine rent reasonableness and how to document that. So there are kind of two main ways to confirm rent reasonableness. One would be to obtain written verification from the landlord or property manager on their letterhead, affirming that the rent is comparable to current rents or being charged for similar unassisted units similar units owned by the same management or property owner. So that's one option. Just get a letter from the landlord property manager just attesting to the fact that that the price being charged for that unit is the same or similar what they're being charged for units that are not using CoC funds. The other way to do a rent reasonable check, and maybe the more common way, because you don't have to necessarily rely on a landlord to get you a letter, would be to use a rent reasonableness checklist and certification form. So HUD has a form that they use that you can use or you can modify, and we will look at that in a second. But yeah, so you can use a checklist to compare similar units. You must include supporting documentation when using the checklist. So the checklist, what we're going to look at, you'll kind of enter information like about the condition and size and price of a unit. But you also need to include actual documentation of that unit. So it would usually be like printouts of a rental listing from online or newspaper ads or listings, which is that you can't just have a checklist without any additional documentation. You do need to provide the documentation as well. The form also needs to include a staff signature. So again, your policies and procedures should outline who is responsible for completing this checklist and who would be signing it. And then leasing projects must also compare the rent with the current fair market rent rates and document fair market rent in a different file. So we will talk about fair market rate here in a second. But that's something that also has to be documented, but only if your project utilizes leasing funds to pay for housing. Again, comparable rents can vary over time with market changes, so it is important to ensure that your comparisons are using up-to-date data and appropriate for the prospective unit. So maybe you did a rent reasonableness check in the similar area, but that's been like 7 or 8 months ago. You probably need to go ahead and do it again if you're housing someone else in that area, because you can't necessarily just assume all those conditions are the same. The rental market can be pretty volatile, so just making sure that you have up-to-date comparisons. So some communities choose to centralize this process of rent reasonableness checks by creating or maintaining like a database of comparable units. Sometimes public housing authorities in areas may maintain rental market survey data that you can access, but you need to make sure that any sources of comparables you're looking at take into account the different qualities of units, including size, location, like if utilities are included, just the general condition of the unit. And it may be helpful to consult real estate agents if you're having trouble finding comparable units. If there's just not a lot of units available and you can't find something that you think is comparable, there are professionals who find units for a job. So maybe it would be helpful to tap into their resources. And I guess let's take a look at the rent reasonableness checklist here. Try to share my. All right, so I guess can everyone see that?
Yes.
All right, so again, this is a checklist from HUD. So you can use this as is or kind of change it, modify it a bit. So on this form, you can see there's a column here for the information about the unit that you're thinking about moving the client into. And then we have 3 other columns for comparable units. So you can see again, kind of all of the different characteristics you need to be considering when finding comparable units. Comparable units don't necessarily have to be identical across all these categories, but they should be broadly similar. Like if you have one unit that's 750 square feet and one that's like 800 square feet, like that's not a big deal, but try to make sure they're as similar as possible. So again, you want to check, you write the address of where the unit's located, kind of the size of the unit in bedrooms, square feet, the type of unit. Is it a apartment building? Is it a single family home? Is it a duplex? The housing condition, location, any kind of amenities. These could be important to consider, especially amenities like inside a unit. The unit provides like a washer and dryer, for example, and another unit doesn't. That's something worth noting. It's the age of the unit, again, the utilities, and whether or not the utilities are covered by the rent or if that's the responsibility of the tenant. And is the unit handicap accessible? And then you'll want to record the rent, what would be charged for the rent. There's kind of simple calculation that occurs to determine at that point if the rent is reasonable. So basically you'll want to probably take the average price of these 3 comparable units and compare that to what you're looking at for the unit for your client. So when you also need to consider utility allowance. If utilities are not included in the price of rent, then there is a certain utility allowance that can be added on top of the rent. we link to at the end of this presentation another training did a while ago that goes into more detail on utility allowance. But basically know that when looking at comparable rent, you need to be paying attention to the gross rent, so the contract rent plus the utility allowance. Yeah, so in this case, you have an average from the comparable units, and you're comparing that average to the amount of the rent plus utility allowance for the unit you're looking at. And again, your policies and procedures should probably specify, like, can you not go over that average at all? Can you go over that average by a few dollars? Just kind of making that clear what is not reasonable. At the bottom of this form, you'd kind of make the official determination if it's reasonable or not, sign it. And then again, it is important to include the additional documentation of like the rental listings along with this form. This form by itself is not adequate. So that's it on that form.
Hey, Axton, can you pull it back up for just a second? I wanted to highlight something really quick that you had started to touch on, but I just wanted to go a little bit more detail into that form. Thank you. So at the bottom, part B, so Axton mentioned you do have to certify whether it is or is not reasonable. If through this process you determine it is not reasonable, then that you cannot spend as CoC funds on that unit, which sounds really straightforward. However, we have seen folks who have checked that it was not reasonable, whether that was an error or on purpose, and then still use that form. So if through this process you determine that it is not reasonable, you need to identify a new unit. The completion of this form along with the supporting documentation isn't sufficient. It needs to be completed and certified that it is reasonable. So I just wanted to highlight that really quick. I know that's really straightforward, but I think it's something worth mentioning, especially if you are new to this process. Thanks, Axton. I think that is all I had for that. I will go back to the PowerPoint for you. All right, hopefully everyone can see the PowerPoint. I think we're on to
Yes.
the next slide at this point.
All right, so briefly here about fair market rent. So what is fair market rent? Or FMR. FMRs are estimates of the cost of a unit plus the utilities for that unit. FMR is determined by HUD annually based on a standard calculation, and those determinations are posted online annually. There is a link at the end of this presentation that links to HUD's website where you go to check for FMRs. So the FMR, kind of technical here, the FMR is set at the 40th percentile rent in an area. So that means they basically look at all the units in an area and they set the FMR so that 40% of the units in the area fall below that amount. When making that calculation, I believe HUD excludes certain types of housing, like they don't consider public housing or newly built units or substandard units when making that calculation. There is only one FMR per geographic area. However, if you have a project that is serving multiple geographic areas, you will need to make sure that you are referencing the correct FMR when necessary. Yeah, I think that's it on FMR. All right, so your relationship to FMRs and fair market rent or fair market rent and rent reasonableness is going to vary slightly between different project types. So when CoC funds are used to pay for a participant's unit, the unit must meet the following standards dependent on project type. So if you have a project that is paying for participants' housing using leasing funds, so these would generally be permanent supportive housing projects or transitional housing projects, although not all permanent supporting or transitional. But yeah, if you are using leasing funds to cover housing costs, then the rent that you're paying for a unit must not exceed the FMR for an area, and it must be reasonable. So for leasing projects, it's possible that the reasonable rent rate that you determined may be lower than the FMR in the area. I'd say that's maybe not very common, but it is possible. And in that case, the reasonable rent would then be kind of the max that you can spend on the unit and not the FMR. Also for leasing, if the gross rent for the unit is reasonable but exceeds FMR, technically CoC program recipients may use CoC leasing funds to pay a portion of that rent, but you'd have to find another source of funds to cover the difference, the amount of rent that's over FMR. I think it's fairly uncommon for programs to try to even access these type of units. Because again, you can't use CoC funds to pay for any unit that's over FMR. So for example, some projects have participants pay a portion of rent, but that rent paid would count as program income, therefore part of this CoC funds basically. And so again, funds that cannot be used to pay for rent over FMR. So all of that's kind of a big caveat that technically you can use CoC funds to pay a portion of rent for an more expensive unit, but you would have to find a different source of funds to cover the difference, and most projects don't bother with that. So the other type of way to pay for a unit would be with rental assistance funds. So these would generally be permanent supportive housing projects or rapid rehousing projects. So when you are paying for a unit with rental assistance funds, the unit price can exceed the FMR as long as the rent is still reasonable. However, your contract budget is calculated based on FMR. So you may be familiar when you're applying for these grant funds, the amount of funds available to you for rental assistance is going to be in proportion to the number of units you're saying you're going to serve times the FMR in that area, basically. So technically you can pay for a unit that's reasonable, but over FMR in this case, but you may end up not being able to serve as many units doing that. Like if all of your units happen to be over FMR and the amount of money you were given was based on that FMR,